persecution of the Christians by the Goths and Vandals, many Scythian Goths having embraced Christianity about the time of Constantine the Great, the light of the gospel spread itself considerably in Scythia, though the two kings who ruled that country and the majority of the people continued pagans. Fritigern, king of the West Goths, was an ally to the Romans, but Athanaric, king of the East Goths, was at war with them. The Christians in the dominions of the former lived unmolested, but the latter, having been defeated by the Romans, wreaked his vengeance on his Christian subjects, commencing his pagan injunctions in the year 370. Eusebius, bishop of Samosata, makes a most distinguished figure in the ecclesiastical history, and was one of the most eminent champions of Christ against the Arian heresy. Eusebius, after being driven from his church and wandering about through Syria and Palestine, encouraging the Orthodox, was restored with other Orthodox prelates to his see, which, however, he did not long enjoy, for an Arian woman threw a tile at him from the top of a house, which fractured his skull and terminated his life in the year 380. The Vandals, passing from Spain to Africa in the 5th century under their leader Genseric, committed the most unheard-of cruelties. They persecuted the Christians wherever they came, and even laid waste the country as they passed, that the Christians left behind, who had escaped them, might not be able to subsist. Sometimes they freighted a vessel with martyrs, let it drift out to sea, or set fire to it, with the sufferers shackled on the decks. Having seized and plundered the city of Carthage, they put the bishop and the clergy into a leaky ship and committed it to the mercy of the waves, thinking that they must all perish of course. But providentially, the vessel arrived safe at Naples. Innumerable Orthodox Christians were beaten, scourged, and banished to Capsur, where it pleased God to make them the means of converting many of the Moors to Christianity. But this, coming to the ears of Genseric, he sent orders that they and their new converts should be tied by the feet to chariots and dragged about until they were dashed to pieces. Martyrs. Pampinian, the bishop of Mansuet, was tortured to death with plates of hot iron. The bishop of Urisi was burnt, and the bishop of Habensa was banished for refusing to deliver up the sacred books which were in his possession. The Vandalian tyrant Genseric, having made an expedition into Italy and plundered the city of Rome, returned to Africa, flushed with the success of his arms. The Arians took this occasion to persuade him to persecute the Orthodox Christians, as they assured him that they were friends to the people of Rome. After the decease of Huneric, his successor recalled him and the rest of the Orthodox clergy. The Arians, taking the alarm, persuaded him to banish them again, which he complied with, when Eugenius, exiled to Languedoc in France, died there of the hardships he underwent on the 6th of September, AD 305, persecutions from about the middle of the 5th to the conclusion of the 7th century. Proterius was made a priest by Cyril, bishop of Alexandria, who was well acquainted with his virtues, before he appointed him to preach. On the death of Cyril, the see of Alexandria was filled by Dioscorus, an inveterate enemy to the memory and family of his predecessor. Being condemned by the Council of Chalcedon for having embraced the errors of Eutyches, he was deposed and Proterius chosen to fill the vacant see, who was approved of by the emperor. This occasioned a dangerous insurrection, for the city of Alexandria was divided into two factions, the one to espouse the cause of the old and the other of the new prelate. In one of the commotions, the Eutychians determined to wreak their vengeance on Proterius, who fled to the church for sanctuary. But on Good Friday, AD 457, a large body of them rushed into the church and barbarously murdered the prelate, after which they dragged the body through the streets, insulted it, cut it to pieces, burnt it, and scattered the ashes in the air. Hermenegildus, a Gothic prince, was the eldest son of Leovigildus, a king of the Goths in Spain. This prince, who was originally an Arian, became a convert to the Orthodox faith by means of his wife Ingonda. When the king heard that his son had changed his religious sentiments, he stripped him of the command at Seville, where he was governor, and threatened to put him to death unless he renounced the faith he had newly embraced. The prince, in order to prevent the execution of his father's menaces, began to put himself into a posture of defense, and many of the Orthodox persuasion in Spain declared for him. The king, exasperated at this act of rebellion, began to punish all the Orthodox Christians who could be seized by his troops, and thus a very severe persecution commenced. He likewise marched against his son at the head of a very powerful army. The prince took refuge in Seville, from which he fled, and was at length besieged and taken at Asieta. Loaded with chains, Heydrich was sent to Seville, and at the feast of Easter, refusing to receive the Eucharist from an Arian bishop, the enraged king ordered his guards to cut the prince to pieces, which they punctually performed, April 13th, AD 586. Martin, Bishop of Rome, was born at Todi in Italy. He was naturally inclined to virtue, and his parents bestowed on him an admirable education. He opposed the heretics called Monothelites, who were patronized by the Emperor Heraclius. Martin was condemned at Constantinople, where he was exposed in the most public places to the ridicule of the people, divested of all episcopal marks of distinction, and treated with the greatest scorn and severity. After lying some months in prison, Martin was sent to an island at some distance, and there cut to pieces, AD 655. John, Bishop of Bergamo in Lombardy, was a learned man and a good Christian. He did his utmost endeavors to clear the church from the errors of Arianism, and joining in this holy work with John, Bishop of Milan, he was very successful against the heretics, on which account he was assassinated on July 11th, AD 683. Cillian was born in Ireland and received from his parents a pious and Christian education. He obtained the Roman pontiff's license to preach to the pagans in Franconia, in Germany. At Würzburg, he converted Gosbert, the governor, whose example was followed by the greater part of the people in 2 years after. Persuading Gosbert that his marriage with his brother's widow was sinful, the latter had him beheaded, AD 689, persecutions from the early part of the 8th to near the conclusion of the 10th century. Boniface, Archbishop of Mentz and father of the German Church, was an Englishman and is, in ecclesiastical history, looked upon as one of the brightest ornaments of this nation. Originally his name was Winfrid, or Winfrith, and he was born at Curton in Devonshire, then part of the West Saxon kingdom. When he was only about 6 years of age, he began to discover a propensity to reflection, and seemed solicitous to gain information on religious subjects. Wulfrat, the abbot, finding that he possessed a bright genius, as well as a strong inclination to study, had him removed to Nutsell, a seminary of learning in the Diocese of Winchester, where he would have a much greater opportunity of attaining improvement than at Exeter. After due study, the abbot, seeing him qualified for the priesthood, obliged him to receive that holy order when he was about 30 years old, from which time he began to preach and labor for the salvation of his fellow creatures. He was released to attend a synod of bishops in the kingdom of West Saxons. He afterwards, in 719, went to Rome, where Gregory II, who then sat in Peter's chair, received him with great friendship, and finding him full of all the virtues that compose the character of an apostolic missionary, dismissed him with commission at large to preach the gospel to the pagans wherever he found them. Passing through Lombardy and Bavaria, he came to Thuringia, which country had before received the light of the gospel. He next visited Utrecht, and then proceeded to Saxony, where he converted some thousands to Christianity. During the ministry of this meek prelate, Pepin was declared King of France. It was that prince's ambition to be crowned by the most holy prelate he could find, and Boniface was pitched on to perform that ceremony, which he did at Soissons in 752. The next year, his great age and many infirmities lay so heavy on him that with the consent of the new king, the bishops, etc. of his diocese, he consecrated Lullus, his countryman and faithful disciple, and placed him in the see of Mentz. When he had thus eased himself of his charge, He recommended the Church of Mentz to the care of the new bishop in very strong terms, desired he would finish the church at Fulda and see him buried in it, for his end was near. Having left these orders, he took boat to the Rhine and went to Friesland, where he converted and baptized several thousands of barbarous natives, demolished the temples, and raised churches on the ruins of those superstitious structures. A day being appointed for confirming a great number of new converts, he ordered them to assemble in a new open plain near the river Bourd. Thither he repaired the day before, and, pitching a tent, determined to remain on the spot all night in order to be ready early in the morning. Some pagans, who were his inveterate enemies, having intelligence of this, poured down upon him and the companions of his mission in the night, and killed him and 52 of his companions and attendants on June 5th, A.D. 755. Thus fell the great father of the Germanic Church, the honor of England and the glory of the age in which he lived. 42 persons of Armorian in Upper Phrygia were martyred in the year 845 by the Saracens, the circumstances of which transaction are as follows. In the reign of Theophilus, the Saracens ravaged many parts of the Eastern Empire, gained several considerable advantages over the Christians, took the city of Armorian, and numbers suffered martyrdom. Flora and Mary, two ladies of distinction, suffered martyrdom at the same time. Perfectus was born at Cordoba in Spain and brought up in the Christian faith. Having a quick genius, he made himself master of all the useful and polite literature of that age, and at the same time was not more celebrated for his abilities than admired for his piety. At length he took priest's orders, and performed the duties of his office with great assiduity and punctuality. Publicly declaring Mahomet an impostor, he was sentenced to be beheaded, and was accordingly executed, A.D. 850, after which his body was honorably interred by the Christians. Adalbert, Bishop of Prague, a Bohemian by birth, after being involved in many troubles, began to direct his thoughts to the conversion of the infidels, to which end he repaired to Danzig, where he converted and baptized many, which so enraged the pagan priests that they fell upon him and dispatched him with darts on the 23rd of April, A.D. 997. Persecutions in the 11th century. Alphage, Archbishop of Canterbury, was descended from a considerable family in Gloucestershire, and received an education suitable to his illustrious birth. His parents were worthy Christians, and Alphage seemed to inherit their virtues. The see of Winchester, being vacant by the death of Ethelwold Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, as primate of all England, consecrated Alphege to the vacant bishopric, to the general satisfaction of all concerned in the diocese. Dunstan had an extraordinary veneration for Alphege, and when at the point of death, made it his ardent request to God that he might succeed him in the see of Canterbury, which accordingly happened, though not till about 18 years after Dunstan's death in 1006. After Alphege had governed the see of Canterbury about 4 years with great reputation to himself and benefit to his people, the Danes made an incursion into England and laid siege to Canterbury. When the design of attacking this city was known, many of the principal people made a flight from it and would have persuaded Alphege to follow their example. But he, like a good pastor, would not listen to such a proposal. While he was employed in assisting and encouraging the people, Canterbury was taken by storm. The enemy poured into the town and destroyed all that came in their way by fire and sword. He had the courage to address the enemy and offer himself to their swords as more worthy of their rage than the people. He begged they might be saved, and that they would discharge their whole fury upon him. They accordingly seized him, tied his hands, insulted and abused him in a rude and barbarous manner, and obliged him to remain on the spot until his church was burnt and the monks massacred. They then decimated all the inhabitants, both ecclesiastics and laymen, leaving only every 10th person alive, so that they put 72 out of 36 persons to death, and left only 4 monks and 800 laymen alive, after which they confined the archbishop in a dungeon, where they kept him close prisoner for several months. During his confinement, they proposed to him to redeem his liberty with the sum of $3,000 and to persuade the king to purchase their departure out of the kingdom with a further sum of $10,000. As Alfage's circumstances would not allow him to satisfy the exorbitant demand, they bound him and put him to severe torments, to oblige him to discover the treason of the church, upon which they assured him of his life and liberty, but the prelate piously persisted in refusing to give the pagans any account of it. They remanded him to prison again, confined him 6 days longer, and then, taking him prisoner with them to Greenwich, brought him to trial there. He still remained inflexible with respect to the church treasure, but exhorted them to forsake their idolatry and embrace Christianity. This so greatly incensed the Danes that the soldiers dragged him out of the camp and beat him unmercifully. One of the soldiers who had been converted by him, knowing that his pains would be lingering as his death was determined on, actuated by a kind of barbarous compassion, cut off his head and thus put the finishing stroke to his martyrdom, April 19th, A.D. 1012. This transaction happened on the very spot where the church at Greenwich, which is dedicated to him, now stands. After his death, his body was thrown into the Thames, but being found the next day, it was buried in the Cathedral of St. Paul's by the bishops of London and Lincoln, from whence it was, in 1023, removed to Canterbury by Ethelmoth, the archbishop of that province. Gerard, a Venetian, devoted himself to the service of God from his tender years, entered into a religious house for some time, and then determined to visit the Holy Land. Going into Hungary, he became acquainted with Stephen, the king of that country, who made him bishop of Chonad. Uvo and Peter, successors of Stephen, being deposed, Andrew, son of Ladislaus, cousin german to Stephen, had then a tender of the crown made him upon condition that he would employ his authority in extirpating the Christian religion out of Hungary. The ambitious prince came into the proposal, but Gerard, being informed of his impious bargain, thought it his duty to remonstrate against the enormity of Andrew's crime and persuade him to withdraw his promise. In this view, he undertook to go to that prince, attended by 3 prelates, full of like zeal for religion. The new king was at Alba Regalis, but as the 4 bishops were going to cross the Danube, they were stopped by a party of soldiers posted there. They bore an attack of a shower of stones patiently when the soldiers beat them unmercifully, and at length dispatched them with lances. Their martyrdoms happened in the year 1045. Stanislaus, bishop of Krakow, was descended from an illustrious Polish family. The piety of his parents was equal to their opulence, and the latter they rendered subservient to all the purposes of charity and benevolence. Stanislaus remained for some time undetermined whether he should embrace a monastic life or engage among the secular clergy. He was at length persuaded to the latter by Lambert Zula, bishop of Krakow, who gave him holy orders and made him a canon of his cathedral. Lambert died on November 25th, 1071, when all concerned in the choice of a successor declared for Stanislaus, and he succeeded to the prelacy. Boleslaus, the second king of Poland, had by nature many good qualities, but giving way to his passions, he ran into many enormities, and at length had the appellation of cruel bestowed upon him. Stanislaus alone had the courage to tell him of his faults, when, taking a private opportunity, he freely displayed to him the enormities of his crimes. The king, greatly exasperated at his repeated freedoms, at length determined, at any rate, to get the better of a prelate who was so extremely faithful. Hearing one day that the bishop was by himself in the chapel of St. Michael, at a small distance from the town, he dispatched some soldiers to murder him. The soldiers readily undertook the bloody task, but when they came into the presence of Stanislaus, the venerable aspect of the prelate struck them with such awe that they could not perform what they had promised. On their return, the king, finding that they had not obeyed his orders, stormed at them violently, snatched a dagger from one of them, and ran furiously to the chapel, where, finding Stanislaus at the altar, he plunged the weapon into his heart. The prelate immediately expired on the 8th of May, A.D. 1079. Chapter 4. Papal Persecutions. Thus far, our history of persecution has been confined principally to the pagan world. We come now to a period when persecution under the guise of Christianity committed more enormities than ever disgraced the annals of paganism. Disregarding the maxims and the spirit of the gospel, the papal church, arming herself with the power of the sword, vexed the church of God and wasted it for several centuries, a period most appropriately termed in history the Dark Ages. The kings of the earth gave their power to the beast and submitted to be trodden on by the miserable vermin that often filled the papal chair, as in the case of Henry, Emperor of Germany. The storm of papal persecution first burst upon the Waldenses in France. Persecution of the Waldenses in France. Popery, having brought various innovations into the church and overspread the Christian world with darkness and superstition, some few, who plainly perceived the pernicious tendency of such errors, determined to show the light of the gospel in its real purity, and to disperse those clouds which artful priests had raised about it in order to blind the people and obscure its real brightness. The principal among these was Berengarius, who, about the year 1000, boldly preached gospel truths according to their primitive purity. Many, from conviction, assented to his doctrine and were, on that account, called Berengarians. To Berengarius succeeded Peter Bruy, who preached at Toulouse under the protection of an earl named Ildefonsus, and the whole tenets of the reformers, with the reasons of their separation from the Church of Rome, were published in a book written by Bruy under the title of Antichrist. By the year of Christ, 1140, the number of the Reformed was very great, and the probability of its increasing alarmed the Pope, who wrote to several princes to banish them from their dominions and employed many learned men to write against their doctrines. A.D. 1147, Henry of Toulouse, being deemed their most eminent preacher, they were called Hennericians, and as they would not admit of any proofs relative to religion but what could be deduced from the scriptures themselves, the popish party gave them the name of Apostolics. At length, Peter Waldo, or Valdo, a native of Lyons, eminent for his piety and learning, became a strenuous opposer of popery, and from him the Reformed at that time received the appellation of Waldenses or Waldois. Pope Alexander III, being informed by the Bishop of Lyons of these transactions, excommunicated Waldo and his adherents and commanded the bishop to exterminate them, if possible, from the face of the earth, and hence began the papal persecutions against the Waldenses. The proceedings of Waldo and the Reformed occasioned the first rise of the inquisitors, for Pope Innocent III authorized certain monks as inquisitors to inquire for and deliver over the Reformed to the secular power. The process was short, as an accusation was deemed adequate to guilt, and a candid trial was never granted to the accused. The Pope, finding that these cruel means had not the intended effect, sent several learned monks to preach among the Waldenses and to endeavor to argue them out of their opinions. Among these monks was one Dominic, who appeared extremely zealous in the cause of popery. This Dominic instituted an order which, from him, was called the Order of Dominican Friars, and the members of this order have ever since been the principal inquisitors in the various inquisitions in the world. The power of the inquisitors was unlimited. They proceeded against whom they pleased, without any consideration of age, sex, or rank. Let the accusers be ever so infamous, the accusation was deemed valid, and even anonymous information sent by letter were thought sufficient evidence. To be rich was a crime equal to heresy. Therefore, many who had money were accused of heresy, or of being favorers of heretics, that they might be obliged to pay for their opinions. The dearest friends or nearest kindred could not, without danger, serve anyone who was imprisoned on account of religion, to convey to those who were confinite a little straw, or give them a cup of water, was called favoring of the heretics, and they were prosecuted accordingly. No lawyer dared to plead for his own brother, and their malice even extended beyond the grave. Hence the bones of many were dug up and burnt as examples to the living. If a man on his deathbed was accused of being a follower of Waldo, his estates were confiscated and the heir to them defrauded of his inheritance, and some were sent to the Holy Land, while the Dominicans took possession of their houses and properties, and, when the owners returned, would often pretend not to know them. These persecutions were continued for several centuries under different popes and other great dignitaries of the Catholic Church. Persecutions of the Albigenses. The Albigenses were a people of the Reformed religion who inhabited the country of Albi. They were condemned on the score of religion in the Council of Lateran by order of Pope Alexander III. Nevertheless, they increased so prodigiously that many cities were inhabited by persons only of their persuasion, and several eminent noblemen embraced their doctrines. Among the latter were Raymond Earl of Toulouse, Raymond Earl of Foxe, the Earl of Béziers, etc., a friar named Peter. Having been murdered in the dominions of the Earl of Toulouse, the Pope made the murder a pretense to persecute that nobleman and his subjects. To effect this, he sent persons throughout all Europe in order to raise forces to act coercively against the Albigenses, and promised paradise to all that would come to this war, which he termed a holy war, and bear arms for 40 days. The same indulgences were likewise held out to all who entered themselves for the purpose as to such as engaged in crusades to the Holy Land. The brave Earl defended Toulouse and other places with the most heroic bravery and various success against the Pope's legates and Simon Earl of Montfort, a bigoted Catholic nobleman. Unable to subdue the Earl of Toulouse openly, the King of France and Queen Mother and 3 archbishops raised another formidable army and had the art to persuade the Earl of Toulouse to come to a conference, when he was treacherously seized upon, made a prisoner, forced to appear barefooted and bareheaded before his enemies, and compelled to subscribe an abject recantation. This was followed by a severe persecution against the Albigenses, and express orders that the laity should not be permitted to read the sacred scriptures. In the year 1620, also the persecution against the Albigenses was very severe. In 1648, a heavy persecution raged throughout Lithuania and Poland. The cruelty of the Cossacks was so excessive that the Tartars themselves were ashamed of their barbarities. Among others who suffered was the Reverend Adrian Chalinsky, who was roasted alive by a slow fire, and whose sufferings and mode of death may depict the horrors which the professors of Christianity have endured from the enemies of the Redeemer. The reformation of papistical error very early was projected in France, for in the 3rd century a learned man named Almericus and 6 of his disciples were ordered to be burnt at Paris for asserting that God was no otherwise present in the sacramental bread than in any other bread, that it was idolatry to build altars or shrines to saints, and that it was ridiculous to offer incense to them. The martyrdom of Almericus and his pupils did not, however, prevent many from acknowledging the justness of his notions and seeing the purity of the Reformed religion, so that the truth of Christ continually increased, and in time not only spread itself over many parts of France, but diffused the light of the gospel over various other countries. In the year 1524, at a town in France called Meldon, one John Clark set up a bill on the church door, wherein he called the Pope Antichrist. For this offense he was repeatedly whipped and then branded on the forehead. Going afterward to Mentz in Lorraine, he demolished some images, for which he had his right hand and nose cut off, and his arms and breasts torn with pincers. He sustained these cruelties with amazing fortitude, and was even sufficiently cool to sing the 115th Psalm, which expressly forbids idolatry, after which he was thrown into the fire and burnt to ashes. Many persons of the Reformed persuasion were, about this time, beaten, racked, scourged, and burnt to death in several parts of France, but more particularly at Paris, Malda, and Limousin. A native of Malda was burnt by a slow fire for saying that Mass was a plain denial of the death and passion of Christ. At Limousin, John de Cadurco, a clergyman of the Reformed religion, was apprehended, degraded, and ordered to be burnt. Francis Bribard, secretary to Cardinal de Pellay for speaking in favor of the Reformed, had his tongue cut out and was then burnt, A.D. 1545. James Cobard, a schoolmaster in the city of St. Michael, was burnt A.D. 1545 for saying that Mass was useless and absurd, and about the same time 14 men were burnt at Malda, their wives being compelled to stand by and behold the execution. A.D. 1546. Peter Chapeau brought a number of Bibles in the French tongue to France and publicly sold them there, for which he was brought to trial, sentenced, and executed a few days afterward. Soon after, a cripple of Meaux, a schoolmaster of Ferrara named Stephen Pollio, and a man named John English were burnt for the faith. Monsieur Blondel, a rich jeweler, was, A.D. 1548, apprehended at Lyons and sent to Paris, where he was burnt for the faith by order of the court, A.D. 1549. Herbert, a youth of 19 years of age, was committed to the flames at Dijon, as was Florent Venot in the same year. In the year 1554, 2 men of the Reformed religion, with the son and daughter of one of them, were apprehended and committed to the castle of Niverne. On examination, they confessed their faith and were ordered for execution. Being smeared with grease, brimstone, and gunpowder, they cried, salt on this sinful and rotten flesh." Their tongues were then cut out, and they were afterward committed to the flames, which soon consumed them by means of the combustible matter with which they were besmeared. The Bartholomew Massacre at Paris, etc. On the 22nd of August, 1572, commenced this diabolical act of sanguinary brutality. It was intended to destroy at one stroke the root of the Protestant tree, which had only before partially suffered in its branches. The King of France had artfully proposed a marriage between his sister and the Prince of Navarre, the captain and prince of the Protestants. This imprudent marriage was publicly celebrated at Paris, August 18th, by the Cardinal of Bourbon, upon a high stage erected for the purpose. They dined in great pomp with the bishop and supped with the king at Paris. 4 days after this, the prince, as he was coming from the council, was shot in both arms. He then said to More, his deceased mother's minister, "O my brother, I do now perceive that I am indeed beloved of my God, since for his most holy sake I am wounded." Although the vidame advised him to fly, yet he abode in Paris and was soon after slain by Bemges, who afterward declared he never saw a man meet death more valiantly than the admiral. The soldiers were appointed at a certain signal to burst out instantly to the slaughter in all parts of the city. When they had killed the admiral, they threw him out at a window into the street where his head was cut off and sent to the Pope. The savage papists, still raging against him, cut off his arms and private members, and after dragging him 3 days through the streets, hung him up by the heels without the city. After him they slew many great and honorable persons who were Protestants, as Count Rochefoucauld, Tillinius, the admiral's son-in-law, Antonius, Clarimontus, Marquis of Ravelli, Louis Busius, Bandineus, Pluvialius, Bernius, etc., etc. And falling upon the common people, they continued the slaughter for many days. In the 3 first, they slew of all ranks and conditions to the number of 10,000. The bodies were thrown into the rivers, and blood ran through the streets with a strong current, and the river appeared presently like a stream of blood. So furious was their hellish rage that they slew all papists whom they suspected to be not very staunch to their diabolical religion. From Paris the destruction spread to all quarters of the realm. At Orléans 1,000 were slain of men, women, and children, and 6,000 at Rouen. At Meldith 200 were put into prison and brought out by units and cruelly murdered. At Lyons 800 were massacred. Here children hanging about their parents, and parents affectionately embracing their children, were pleasant food for the swords and bloodthirsty minds of those who called themselves the Catholic Church. Here 300 were slain only in the bishop's house, and the impious monks would suffer none to be buried. At Augusta Bona, on the people hearing of the massacre at Paris, they shut their gates that no Protestants might escape, and searching diligently for every individual of the Reformed Church, imprisoned and then barbarously murdered them. The same cruelty they practiced at Avaricum, at Troyes, at Toulouse, Rouen, and many other places, running from city to city, towns and villages through the kingdom. As a corroboration of this horrid carnage, the following interesting narrative, written by a sensible and learned Roman Catholic, appears in this place with peculiar propriety. The nuptials, says he, of the young king of Navarre with the French king's sister was solemnized with pomp, and all the endearments, all the assurances of friendship, all the oaths sacred among men were profusely lavished by Catherine, the Queen Mother, and by the king, during which the rest of the court thought of nothing but festivities, plays, and masquerades. At last, at 12 o'clock at night, on the eve of St. Bartholomew, the signal was given. Immediately all the houses of the Protestants were forced open at once. Admiral Coligny, alarmed by the uproar, jumped out of bed, when a company of assassins rushed in his chamber. They were headed by one Besme, who had been bred up as a domestic in the family of the Guises. This wretch thrust his sword into the admiral's breast and also cut him in the face. Besme was a German, and being afterwards taken by the Protestants, the Rochellers would have bought him in order to hang and quarter him, but he was killed by one Bretonville. Henry, the young Duke of Guise, who afterwards framed the Catholic League and was murdered at Blois, standing at the door till the horrid butchery should be completed, called aloud, "Besme, is it done?" Immediately after which, the ruffians threw the body out of the window, and Coligny expired at Guise's feet. Count de Teligny also fell a sacrifice. He had married, about 10 months before, Coligny's daughter. His countenance was so engaging that the ruffians, when they advanced in order to kill him, were struck with compassion. But others, more barbarous, rushing forward, murdered him. In the meantime, all the friends of Coligny were assassinated throughout Paris. Men, women, and children were promiscuously slaughtered. Every street was strewed with expiring bodies. Some priests, holding up a crucifix in one hand and a dagger in the other, ran to the chiefs of the murderers and strongly exhorted them to spare neither relations nor friends. Tavannes, Marshal of France, an ignorant, superstitious soldier who joined the fury of religion to the rage of party, rode on horseback through the streets of Paris, crying to his men, "Let blood, let blood." Bleeding is as wholesome in August as in May. In the memoirs of the life of this enthusiastic written by his son, we are told that the father, being on his deathbed and making a general confession of his actions, the priest said to him with surprise, "What, no mention of St. Bartholomew's massacre?" To which Tavannes replied, "I consider it as a meritorious action that will wash away all my sins." Such horrid sentiments can a false spirit of religion inspire. The king's palace was one of the chief scenes of the butchery. The king of Navarre had his lodgings in the Louvre, and all his domestics were Protestants. Many of these were killed in bed with their wives. Others, running away naked, were pursued by the soldiers through the several rooms of the palace, even to the king's antechamber. The young wife of Henry of Navarre, awaked by the dreadful uproar, being afraid for her consort and for her own life, seized with horror and half dead, flew from her bed in order to throw herself at the feet of the king, her brother. But scarce had she opened her chamber door when some of her Protestant domestics rushed in for refuge. The soldiers immediately followed, pursued them in sight of the princess, and killed one who had crept under her bed. 2 others, being wounded with halberts, fell at the queen's feet so that she was covered with blood. Count de la Rochefoucauld, a young nobleman, greatly in the king's favor for his comely air, his politeness, and a certain peculiar happiness in the turn of his conversation, had spent the evening till 11 o'clock with the monarch in pleasant familiarity, and had given a loose with the utmost mirth to the sallies of his imagination. The monarch felt some remorse, and being touched with a kind of compassion, bid him 2 or 3 times not to go home, but lie in the Louvre. The Count said he must go to his wife, upon which the king pressed him no farther, but said, "Let him go. I see God has decreed his death." And in 2 hours after he was murdered. Very few of the Protestants escaped the fury of their enthusiastic persecutors. Among these was young La Force, afterwards the famous Marshal de La Force, a child about 10 years of age whose deliverance was exceedingly remarkable. His father, his elder brother, and himself were seized together by the Duke of Anjou's soldiers. These murderers flew at all 3 and struck them at random, when they all fell and lay one upon another. The youngest did not receive a single blow, but appearing as if he was dead, escaped the next day, and his life, thus wonderfully preserved, lasted 85 years. Many of the wretched victims fled to the waterside, and some swam over the Seine to the suburbs of Saint-Germain. The king saw them from his window, which looked upon the river, and fired upon them with a carbine that had been loaded for that purpose by one of his pages, while the Queen Mother, undisturbed and serene in the midst of slaughter, looking down from a balcony, encouraged the murderers and laughed at the dying groans of the slaughtered. This barbarous queen was fired with a restless ambition, and she perpetually shifted her party in order to satiate it. Some days after this horrid transaction, the French court endeavored to palliate it by forms of law. They pretended to justify the massacre by a calumny, and accused the admiral of a conspiracy which no one believed. The Parliament was commanded to proceed against the memory of Coligny, and his dead body was hung in chains on Montfaucon gallows. The king himself went to view this shocking spectacle, when one of his courtiers advising him to retire and complaining of the stench of the corpse, he replied, "A dead enemy smells well." The massacres on St. Bartholomew's Day are painted in the Royal Saloon of the Vatican at Rome with the following inscription, "Pontifex Coligny necem probat, Juve, the Pope approves of Coligny's death." The young King of Navarre was spared through policy rather than from the pity of the Queen Mother, she keeping him prisoner till the king's death, in order that he might be as a security and pledge for the submission of such Protestants as might effect their escape. This horrid butchery was not confined merely to the city of Paris. The like orders were issued from court to the governors of all the provinces in France, so that in a week's time about 100,000 Protestants were cut to pieces in different parts of the kingdom. 2 or 3 governors only refused to obey the king's orders. One of these, named Montmorin, governor of Auvergne, wrote the king the following letter, which deserves to be transmitted to the latest posterity. "Sire, I have received an order under your Majesty's seal to put to death all the Protestants in my province. I have too much respect for your Majesty not to believe the letter a forgery, but if, which God forbid, the order should be genuine, I have too much respect for your Majesty to obey it." At Rome, the horrid joy was so great that they appointed a day of high festival and a jubilee with great indulgence to all who kept it, and showed every expression of gladness they could devise. And the man who first carried the news received 1,000 crowns of the Cardinal of Lorraine for his ungodly message. The king also commanded the day to be kept with every demonstration of joy, concluding now that the whole race of Huguenots was extinct. Many who gave great sums of money for their ransom were immediately after slain, and several towns which were under the king's promise of protection and safety were cut off as soon as they delivered themselves up on those promises to his generals or captains. At Bordeaux, at the instigation of a villainous monk who used to urge the papists to slaughter in his sermons, 264 were cruelly murdered, some of them senators. Another of the same pious fraternity produced a similar slaughter at Agendicum in Maine, where the populace at the Holy Inquisitor's satanical suggestion ran upon the Protestants, slew them, plundered their houses, and pulled down their church. The Duke of Guise, entering into Blois, suffered his soldiers to fly upon the spoil and slay or drown all the Protestants they could find. In this they spared neither age nor sex, defealing the women, and then murdering them, from whence he went to Mer, and committed the same outrages for many days together. Here they found a minister named Cassabonius, and threw him into the river Aiguë. At Anjou they slew Albiacus, a minister, and many women were defiled and murdered there, among whom were 2 sisters, abused before their father, whom the assassins bound to a wall to see them, and then slew them and him. The president of Turin, after giving a large sum for his life, was cruelly beaten with clubs, stripped of his clothes, and hung feet upwards with his head and breast in the river. Before he was dead, they opened his belly, plucked out his entrails, and threw them into the river, and then carried his heart about the city upon a spear. At Bara, great cruelty was used even to young children, whom they cut open, pulled out their entrails, which through very rage they gnawed with their teeth. Those who had fled to the castle, when they yielded, were almost all hanged. Thus they did at the city of Matiscon, counting it sport to cut off their arms and legs and afterward kill them, and for the entertainment of their visitors, they often threw the Protestants from a high bridge into the river, saying, "Did you ever see men leap so well?" At Pena, after promising them safety, 300 were inhumanly butchered, and 45 at Albin on the Lord's Day. At Non, though it yielded on conditions of safeguard, the most horrid spectacles were exhibited. Persons of both sexes and conditions were indiscriminately murdered, the streets ringing with doleful cries and flowing with blood, and the houses flaming with fire, which the abandoned soldiers had thrown in. One woman, being dragged from her hiding place with her husband, was first abused by the brutal soldiers, and then, with a sword, which they commanded her to draw, they forced it, while in her hands, into the bowels of her husband. At Samaro Bridge, they murdered above 100 Protestants after promising them peace, and at Antisidor 100 were killed and cast part into a jakes and part into a river. 100 put into prison at Orleans were destroyed by the furious multitude. The Protestants at Rochelle, who were such as had miraculously escaped the rage of hell and fled there, seeing how ill they fared, who submitted to those holy devils, stood for their lives, and some other cities, encouraged thereby, did the like. Against Rochelle, the king sent almost the whole power of France, which besieged it 7 months, though by their assaults they did very little execution on the inhabitants. Yet, by famine, they destroyed 18,000 out of 22. The dead, being too numerous for the living to bury, became food for vermin and carnivorous birds. Many, taking their coffins into the churchyard, lay down in them and breathed their last. Their diet had long been what the minds of those in plenty shudder at. Even human flesh entrails, dung, and the most loathsome things became at last the only food of those champions for that truth and liberty of which the world was not worthy. At every attack, the besiegers met with such an intrepid reception that they left 132 captains, with a proportionate number of men, dead in the sound field. The siege at last was broken up at the request of the Duke of Anjou, the king's brother, who was proclaimed King of Poland, and the king, being wearied out, easily complied, whereupon honorable conditions were granted them. It is a remarkable interference of Providence that, in all this dreadful massacre, not more than 2 ministers of the gospel were involved in it. The tragical sufferings of the Protestants are too numerous to detail, but the treatment of Philip de Doux will give an idea of the rest. After the miscreants had slain this martyr in his bed, they went to his wife, who was then attended by the midwife, expecting every moment to be delivered. The midwife entreated them to stay the murder, at least till the child, which was the 20th, should be born. Notwithstanding this, they thrust a dagger up to the hilt into the poor woman. Anxious to be delivered, she ran into a corn loft, but hither they pursued her, stabbed her in the belly, and then threw her into the street. By the fall, the child came from the dying mother, and being caught up by one of the Catholic ruffians, he stabbed the infant and then threw it into the river. From the revocation of the Edict of Nantes to the French Revolution in 1789. The persecutions occasioned by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes took place under Louis XIV. This edict was made by Henry the Great of France in 1598 and secured to the Protestants an equal right in every respect, whether civil or religious, with the other subjects of the realm. All those privileges Louis XIII confirmed to the Protestants by another statute called the Edict of Nismes, and kept them inviolably to the end of his reign. On the accession of Louis XIV, the kingdom was almost ruined by civil wars. At this critical juncture, the Protestants, heedless of our Lord's admonition, "They that take the sword shall perish with the sword," took such an active part in favor of the king that he was constrained to acknowledge himself indebted to their arms for his establishment on the throne. Instead of cherishing and rewarding that party who had fought for him, he reasoned that the same power which had protected could overturn him, and, listening to the popish machinations, he began to issue out proscriptions and restrictions indicative of his final determination. Rochelle was presently fettered with an incredible number of denunciations. Montauban and Millau were sacked by soldiers. Popish commissioners were appointed to preside over the affairs of the Protestants, and there was no appeal from their ordinance except to the king's council. This struck at the root of their civil and religious exercises and prevented them, being Protestants, from suing a Catholic in any court of law. This was followed by another injunction to make an inquiry in all parishes into whatever the Protestants had said or done for 20 years past. This filled the prisons with innocent victims and condemned others to the galleys or banishment. Protestants were expelled from all offices, trades, privileges, and employs, thereby depriving them of the means of getting their bread. And they proceeded to such excess in their brutality that they would not suffer even the midwives to officiate, but compelled their women to submit themselves in that crisis of nature to their enemies, the brutal Catholics. Their children were taken from them to be educated by the Catholics, and at 7 years made to embrace popery. The Reformed were prohibited from relieving their own sick or poor, from all private worship, and divine service was to be performed in the presence of a popish priest. To prevent the unfortunate victims from leaving the kingdom, all the passages on the frontiers were strictly guarded. Yet by the good hand of God, about 150,000 escaped their vigilance and emigrated to different countries to relate the dismal narrative. All that has been related hitherto were only infringements on their established charter, the Edict of Nantes. At length, the diabolical revocation of that edict passed on the 18th of October, 1685, and was registered the 22nd in the vacation, contrary to all form of law. Instantly the dragoons were quartered upon the Protestants throughout the realm, and filled all France with the like news, that the king would no longer suffer any Huguenots in his kingdom, and therefore they must resolve to change their religion. Hereupon the intendants in every parish, which were popish governors and spies set over the Protestants, assembled the reformed inhabitants and told them they must without delay turn Catholics, either freely or by force. The Protestants replied they were ready to sacrifice their lives and estates to the king, but their consciences being God's, they could not so dispose of them. Instantly the troops seized the gates and avenues of the cities, and placing guards in all the passages, entered with sword in hand, crying, "Die or be Catholics." In short, they practiced every wickedness and horror they could devise to force them to change their religion. They hung both men and women by their hair or their feet, and smoked them with hay till they were nearly dead, and if they still refused to sign a recantation, they hung them up again and repeated their barbarities till, wearied out with torments without death, they forced many to yield to them. Others they plucked off all the hair of their heads and beards with pincers. Others they threw on great fires and pulled them out again, repeating it till they extorted a promise to recant. Some they stripped naked, and after offering them the most infamous insults, they stuck them with pins from head to foot, and lanced them with penknives, and sometimes with red-hot pincers. They dragged them by the nose till they promised to turn. Sometimes they tied fathers and husbands. while they ravished their wives and daughters before their eyes. Multitudes they imprisoned in the most noisome dungeons, where they practiced all sorts of torments in secret. Their wives and children they shut up in monasteries. Such as endeavored to escape by flight were pursued in the woods and hunted in the fields and shot at like wild beasts, nor did any condition or quality screen them from the ferocity of these infernal dragoons. Even the members of Parliament and military officers, though on actual service, were ordered to quit their posts and repair directly to their houses to suffer the like storm. Such as complained to the king were sent to the Bastille, where they drank of the same cup. The bishops and the intendants marched at the head of the dragoons with a troop of missionaries, monks, and other ecclesiastics to animate the soldiers to an execution so agreeable to their holy church and so glorious to their demon god and their tyrant king. In forming the edict to repeal the Edict of Nantes, the council were divided. Some would have all the ministers detained and forced into popery, as well as the laity. Others were for banishing them, because their presence would strengthen the Protestants in perseverance. And if they were forced to turn, they would ever be secret and powerful enemies in the bosom of the church by their great knowledge and experience in controversial matters. This reason prevailing, they were sentenced to banishment, and only 15 days allowed them to depart the kingdom. The same day the edict for revoking the Protestants' charter was published, they demolished their churches and banished their ministers, whom they allowed but 24 hours to leave Paris. The papists would not suffer them to dispose of their effects, and threw every obstacle in their way to delay their escape till the limited time was expired, which subjected them to condemnation for life to the galleys. The guards were doubled at the seaports, and the prisons were filled with the victims, who endured torments and wants at which human nature must shudder. The sufferings of the ministers and others who were sent to the galleys seemed to exceed all. Chained to the oar, they were exposed to the open air night and day, at all seasons and in all weathers, and when through weakness of body they fainted under the oar, instead of a cordial to revive them, or viands to refresh them, they received only the lashes of a scourge, or the blows of a cane or rope's end. For the want of sufficient clothing and necessary cleanliness, they were most grievously tormented with vermin, and cruelly pinched with the cold, which removed by night the executioners who beat and tormented them by day. Instead of a bed, they were allowed, sick or well, only a hard board, 18 inches broad, to sleep on, without any covering but their wretched apparel, which was a shirt of the coarsest canvas, a little jerkin of red serge, slit up each side up to the armholes, with open sleeves that reached not to the elbow, and once in 3 years they had a coarse frock and a little cap to cover their heads, which were always kept close-shaved as a mark of their infamy. The allowance of provision was as narrow as the sentiments of those who condemned them to such miseries, and their treatment when sick is too shocking to relate, doomed to die upon the boards of a dark hold, covered with vermin, and without the least convenience for the calls of nature. Nor was it among the least of the horrors they endured, that as ministers of Christ and honest men, they were chained side by side to felons and the most execrable villains, whose blasphemous tongues were never idle. If they refused to hear Mass, they were sentenced to the bastinado, of which dreadful punishment the following is a description. Preparatory to it, the chains are taken off, and the victims delivered into the hands of the Turks that precede at the oars, who strip them quite naked, and stretching them upon a great gun, they are held so that they cannot steer, during which there reigns an awful silence throughout the galley. The Turk who is appointed the executioner, and who thinks the sacrifice acceptable to his prophet Mahomet, most cruelly beats the wretched victim with a rough cudgel, or knotty rope's end, till the skin is flayed off his bones, and he is near the point of expiring. Then they apply a most tormenting mixture of vinegar and salt, and consign him to that most intolerable hospital, where thousands under their cruelties have expired. Martyrdom of John Callis. We pass over many other individual martyrdoms to insert that of John Callis, which took place so lately as 1761, and is an indubitable proof of the bigotry of popery, and shows that neither experience nor improvement can root out the inveterate prejudices of the Roman Catholics, or render them less cruel or inexorable to Protestants. John Callis was a merchant of the city of Toulouse, where he had been settled and lived in good repute, and had married an English woman of French extraction. Callis and his wife were Protestants and had 5 sons, whom they educated in the same religion. But Louis, one of the sons, became a Roman Catholic, having been converted by a maidservant who had lived in the family about 30 years. The father, however, did not express any resentment or ill will upon the occasion, but kept the maid in the family and settled an annuity upon the son. In October 1761, the family consisted of John Callis and his wife, one woman servant, Mark Antony Callis, the eldest son, and Peter Callis, the second son. Mark Antony was bred to the law, but could not be admitted to practice on account of his being a Protestant. Hence he grew melancholy, read all the books he could procure relative to suicide, and seemed determined to destroy himself. To this may be added that he led a dissipated life, was greatly addicted to gaming, and did all which could constitute the character of a libertine, on which account his father frequently reprehended him, and sometimes in terms of severity, which considerably added to the doom that seemed to oppress him. On the 13th of October 1761, Mr. Gobert Lavesse, a young gentleman about 19 years of age, the son of Lavesse, a celebrated as advocate of Toulouse, about 5 o'clock in the evening, was met by John Callis, the father, and the eldest son, Mark Antony, who was his friend. Callas, the father, invited him to supper, and the family and their guest sat down in a room up one pair of stairs. The whole company, consisting of Callas, the father, and his wife, Antony, and Peter Callas, the sons, and Lavesse, the guest, no other person being in the house except the maid-servant who has been already mentioned. It was now about 7 o'clock. The supper was not long, but before it was over, Antony left the table and went into the kitchen, which was on the same floor as he was accustomed to do. The maid asked him if he was cold. He answered, "Quite the contrary, I burn," and then left her. In the meantime, his friend and family left the room they had supped in and went into a bedchamber. The father and Lavesse sat down together on a sofa, the younger son, Peter, in an elbow chair, and the mother in another chair, and, without making any inquiry after Antony, continued in conversation together till between 9 and 10 o'clock, when Lavesse took his leave, and Peter, who had fallen asleep, was awakened to attend him with a light. On the ground floor of Callis's house was a shop and a warehouse, the latter of which was divided from the shop by a pair of folding doors. When Peter Callis and Lavesse came downstairs into the shop, they were extremely shocked to see Antony hanging in his shirt from a bar which he had laid across the top of the 2 folding doors, having half opened them for that purpose. On discovery of this horrid spectacle, they shrieked out, which brought down Callis the father, the mother being seized with such terror as kept her trembling in the passage above. When the maid discovered what had happened, she continued below, either because she feared to carry an account of it to her mistress, or because she busied herself in doing some good office to her master, who was embracing the body of his son and bathing it in his tears. The mother, therefore, being thus left alone, went down and mixed in the scene that has been already described, with such emotions as it must naturally produce. In the meantime, Peter had been sent for Lamoire, a surgeon in the neighborhood. Lamoire was not at home, but his apprentice, Mr. Grosel, came instantly. Upon examination, he found the body quite dead, and by this time a papistical crowd of people were gathered about the house, and, having by some means heard that Antony Callis was suddenly dead, and that the surgeon who had examined the body declared that he had been strangled, they took it into their heads he had been murdered, and as the family was Protestant, they presently supposed that the young man was about to change his religion, and had been put to death for that reason. The poor father, overwhelmed with grief for the loss of his child, was advised by his friends to send for the officers of justice to prevent his being torn to pieces by the Catholic multitude, who supposed he had murdered his son. This was accordingly done, And David, the chief magistrate, or capitol, took the father, Peter the son, the mother, Lavaise, and the maid, all into custody, and set a guard over them. He sent for Monsieur de la Tour, a physician, and M.M. Lamarck and Perronnet, surgeons, who examined the body for marks of violence, but found none except the mark of the ligature on the neck. They found also the hair of the deceased done up in the usual manner, perfectly smooth and without the least disorder. His clothes were also regularly folded up and laid upon the counter, nor was his shirt either torn or unbuttoned. Notwithstanding these innocent appearances, the Capitoul thought proper to agree with the opinion of the mob, and took it into his head that old Calas had sent for Lavesse, telling him that he had a son to be hanged, that Lavesse had come to perform the office of executioner, and that he had received assistance from the father and brother. As no proof of the supposed fact could be procured, the Capitale had recourse to a monitory or general information in which the crime was taken for granted, and persons were required to give such testimony against it as they were able. This recites that Lavesse was commissioned by the Protestants to be their executioner in ordinary when any of their children were to be hanged for changing their religion. It recites also that when the Protestants thus hang their children, they compel them to kneel, and one of the interrogatories was whether any person had seen Antony Calas kneel before his father when he strangled him. It recites likewise that Antony died a Roman Catholic and requires evidence of his Catholicism. But before this monitory was published, the mob had got a notion that Antony Calas was the next day to have entered into the fraternity of the White Penitents. The Capitale therefore caused his body to be buried in the middle of St. Stephen's Church. A few days after the interment of the deceased, the White Penitents performed a solemn service for him in their chapel. The church was hung with white, and a tomb was raised in the middle of it, on the top of which was placed a human skeleton, holding in one hand a paper on which was written "Abjuration of Heresy," and in the other a palm, the emblem of martyrdom. The next day the Franciscans performed a service of the same kind for him. The Capitoul continued the persecution with unrelenting severity, and, without the least proof coming in, thought fit to condemn the unhappy father, mother, brother, friend, and servant to the torture, and put them all into irons on the 18th of November. From these dreadful proceedings, the sufferers appealed to the Parliament, which immediately took cognizance of the affair and annulled the sentence of the Capitale as irregular, but they continued the prosecution, and upon the hangman deposing it was impossible Antony should hang himself as was pretended, the majority of the Parliament were of the opinion that the prisoners were guilty, and therefore ordered them to be tried by the criminal court of Toulouse. One voted him innocent, but after long debates, the majority was for the torture and wheel, and probably condemned the father by way of experiment, whether he was guilty or not, hoping he would, in the agony, confess the crime and accuse the other prisoners, whose fate, therefore, they suspended. Poor Calas, however, an old man of 68, was condemned to this dreadful punishment alone. He suffered the torture with great constancy, and was led to execution in a frame of mind which excited the admiration of all that saw him, and particularly of the two Dominicans, Father Bourges and Father Coldaigues, who attended him in his last moments, and declared that they thought him not only innocent of the crime laid to his charge, but an exemplary instance of true Christian patience, fortitude, and charity. When he saw the executioner prepared to give him the last stroke, he made a fresh declaration to Father Bourges, but while the words were still in his mouth, the Capitale, the author of this catastrophe, and who came upon the scaffold merely to gratify his desire of being a witness of his punishment and death, ran up to him and bawled out, "Wretch, there are the fagots which are to reduce your body to ashes. Speak the truth." Monsieur Calas made no reply, but turned his head a little aside, and that moment the executioner did his office. The popular outcry against this family was so violent in Languedoc that everybody expected to see the children of Calas broke upon the wheel and the mother burnt alive. Young Donat Calas was advised to fly into Switzerland. He went and found a gentleman who, at first, could only pity and relieve him, without daring to judge of the rigor exercised against the father, mother, and brothers. Soon after, one of the brothers, who was only banished, likewise threw himself into the arms of the same person, who, for more than a month, took every possible precaution to be assured of the innocence of the family. Once convinced, he thought himself obliged, in conscience, to employ his friends, his purse, his pen, and his credit to repair the fatal mistake of the 7 judges of Toulouse and to have the proceedings revised by the King's Council. This revision lasted 3 years, and it is well known what honor Messrs de Graune and Bacancourt acquired by investigating this memorable cause. 50 masters of the Court of Requests unanimously declared the whole family of Calas innocent and recommended them to the benevolent justice of His Majesty. The Duc de Choiseul, who never let slip an opportunity of signalizing the greatness of his character, not only assisted this unfortunate family with money, but obtained for them a gratuity of 36,000 livres from the king. On the 9th of March, 1765, the arrêt was signed which justified the family of Calas and changed their fate. The 9th of March, 1762, was the very day on which the innocent and virtuous father of that family had been executed. All Paris ran in crowds to see them come out of prison and clapped their hands for joy while the tears streamed from their eyes. This dreadful example of bigotry employed the pen of Voltaire in deprecation of the horrors of superstition, and though an infidel himself, his essay on toleration does honor to his pen and has been a blessed means of abating the rigor of persecution in most European states. Gospel purity will equally shun superstition and cruelty as the mildness of Christ's tenets teaches, only to comfort in this world and to procure salvation in the next. To persecute for being of a different opinion is as absurd as to persecute for having a different countenance. If we honor God, keep sacred the pure doctrines of Christ, put a full confidence in the promises contained in the Holy Scriptures, and obey the political laws of the state in which we reside, we have an undoubted right to protection instead of persecution, and to serve heaven as our consciences, regulated by the gospel rules, may direct. Chapter 5, an account of the Inquisition. When the Reformed religion began to diffuse the gospel light throughout church, he accordingly instituted a number of inquisitors, or persons who were to make inquiry after, apprehend, and punish heretics, as the Reformed were called by the Papists. At the head of these inquisitors was one Dominic, who had been canonized by the Pope in order to render his authority the more respectable. Dominic and the other inquisitors spread themselves into various Roman Catholic countries and treated the Protestants with the utmost severity. In process of time, the Pope, not finding these roving inquisitors so useful as he had imagined, resolved upon the establishment of fixed and regular courts of inquisition. After the order for these regular courts, the first office of inquisition was established in the city of Toulouse, and Dominic became the first regular inquisitor, as he had before been the first roving inquisitor. Courts of inquisition were now erected in several countries, but the Spanish Inquisition became the most powerful and the most dreaded of any. Even the kings of Spain themselves, though arbitrary in all other respects, were taught to dread the power of the lords of the Inquisition, and the horrid cruelties they exercised compelled multitudes who differed in opinion from the Roman Catholics carefully to conceal their sentiments. The most zealous of all the popish monks, and those who most implicitly obeyed the Church of Rome, were the Dominicans and Franciscans. These, therefore, the Pope thought proper to invest with an exclusive right of presiding over the different court of inquisition, and gave them the most unlimited powers as judges delegated by him and immediately representing his person. They were permitted to excommunicate or sentence to death whom they thought proper upon the most slight information of heresy. They were allowed to publish crusades against all whom they deemed heretics and enter into leagues with sovereign princes to join their crusades with their forces. In 1244, their power was farther increased by the Emperor Frederick II, who declared himself the protector and friend of all the inquisitors and published the cruel edicts, viz. 1. That all heretics who continued obstinate should be burnt. 2. That all heretics who repented should be imprisoned for life. This zeal in the emperor for the inquisitors of the Roman Catholic persuasion arose from a report which had been propagated throughout Europe that he intended to renounce Christianity and turn Mohammedan. The emperor, therefore, attempted, by the height of bigotry, to contradict the report and to show his attachment to popery by cruelty. The officers of the Inquisition are 3 inquisitors or judges, a fiscal proctor, 2 secretaries, a magistrate, a messenger, a receiver, a jailer, an agent of confiscated possessions, several assessors, counselors, executioners, physicians, surgeons, doorkeepers, familiars, and visitors who are sworn to secrecy. The principal accusation against those who are subject to this tribunal is heresy, which comprises all that is spoken or written against any of the articles of the creed or the traditions of the Roman Church. The Inquisition likewise takes cognizance of such as are accused of being magicians and of such who read the Bible in the common language, the Talmud of the Jews, or the Alcoran of the Mahometans. Upon all occasions, the inquisitors carry on their processes with the utmost severity and punish those who offend them with the most unparalleled cruelty. A Protestant has seldom any mercy shown him, and a Jew who turns Christian is far from being secure. A defense in the Inquisition is of little use to the prisoner, for a suspicion only is deemed sufficient cause of condemnation, and the greater his wealth, the greater his danger. The principal part of the inquisitors' cruelties is owing to their rapacity. They destroy the life to possess the property, and under the pretense of zeal, plunder each obnoxious individual. A prisoner in the Inquisition is never allowed to see the face of his accuser or of the witnesses against him, but every method is taken by threats and tortures to oblige him to accuse himself and by that means corroborate their evidence. If the jurisdiction of the Inquisition is not fully allowed, vengeance is denounced against such as call it in question, for if any of its officers are opposed, those who oppose them are almost certain to be sufferers for their temerity, the maxim of the Inquisition being to strike terror and awe those who are the objects of its power into obedience. High birth, distinguished rank, great dignity, or eminent employments are no protection from its severities, and the lowest officers of the Inquisition can make the highest characters tremble. When the person impeached is condemned, he is either severely whipped, violently tortured, sent to the galleys, or sentenced to death, and in either case the effects are confiscated. After judgment, a procession is performed to the place of execution, which ceremony is called an auto de fe, or act of faith. The following is an account of an auto de fe performed at Madrid in the year 1682. The officers of the Inquisition, preceded by trumpets, kettle drums, and their banner, marched on the 30th of May in cavalcade to the palace of the Great Square, where they declared by proclamation that, on the 30th of June, the sentence of the prisoners would be put in execution. Of these prisoners, 20 men and women, with 1 renegade Mahometan, were ordered to be burned, 50 Jews and Jewesses having never before been imprisoned and repenting of their crimes were sentenced to a long confinement and to wear a yellow cap. The whole court of Spain was present on this occasion. The Grand Inquisitor's chair was placed in a sort of tribunal far above that of the king. Among those who were to suffer was a young Jewess of exquisite beauty and but 17 years of age. Being on the same side of the scaffold where the queen was seated, she addressed her in hopes of obtaining a pardon in the following pathetic speech. Great Queen, will not your royal presence be of some service to thee in my miserable condition? Have regard to my youth, and oh, consider that I am about to die for professing a religion imbibed from my earliest infancy. Her Majesty seemed greatly to pity her distress, but turned away her eyes, as she did not dare to speak a word in behalf of a person who had been declared a heretic. Now Mass began, in the midst of which the priest came from the altar, placed himself near the scaffold, and seated himself in a chair prepared for that purpose. The chief inquisitor then descended from the amphitheater, dressed in his cope, and having a mitre on his head. After having bowed to the altar, he advanced towards the king's balcony, and went up to it, attended by some of his officers, carrying a cross and the Gospels, with a book containing the oath by which the kings of Spain oblige themselves to protect the Catholic faith, to extirpate heretics, and to support with all their power and force the prosecutions and decrees of the Inquisition. A like oath was administered to the councillors and whole assembly. The Mass was begun about 12 at noon, and did not end till 9 in the evening, being protracted by a proclamation of the sentences of the several criminals, which were already separately rehearsed alud one after the other. After this followed the burning of the 21 men and women, whose intrepidity in suffering that horrid death was truly astonishing. The king's near situation to the criminals rendered their dying groans very audible to him. He could not, however, be absent from this dreadful scene, as it is esteemed a religious one, and his coronation oath obliges him to give a sanction by his presence to all the acts of the tribunal. What we have already said may be applied to inquisitions in general, as well as to that of Spain in particular. The Inquisition belonging to Portugal is exactly upon a similar plan to that of Spain, having been instituted much about the same time, and put under the same regulations. The inquisitors allow the torture to be used only 3 times, but during those times it is so severely inflicted that the prisoner either dies under it or continues always after a cripple, and suffers the severest pains upon every change of weather. We shall give an ample description of the severe torments occasioned by the torture, from the account of one who suffered it the 3 respective times, but happily survived the cruelties he underwent. At the first time of torturing, 6 executioners entered, stripped him naked to his drawers, and laid him upon his back on a kind of stand, elevated a few feet from the floor. The operation commenced by putting an iron collar round his neck and a ring to each foot, which fastened him to the stand. His limbs being thus stretched out, they wound 2 ropes round each thigh, which ropes being passed under the scaffold through holes made for that purpose, were all drawn tight at the same instant of time by 4 of the men on a given signal. It is easy to conceive that the pains which immediately succeeded were intolerable. The ropes, which were of a small size, cut through the prisoner's flesh to the bone, making the blood to gush out at 8 different places, thus bound at a time. As the prisoner persisted in not making any confession of what the inquisitors required, the ropes were drawn in this manner 4 times successively. The manner of inflicting the second torture was as follows. They forced his arms backwards so that the palms of his hands were turned outward behind him, when by means of a rope that fastened them together at the wrists, and which was turned by an engine, they drew them by degrees nearer each other in such a manner that the back of each hand touched and stood exactly parallel to each other. In consequence of this violent contortion, both his shoulders became dislocated, and a considerable quantity of blood issued from his mouth. This torture was repeated 3, after which he was again taken to the dungeon, and the surgeon set the dislocated bones. 2 months after the second torture, the prisoner, being a little recovered, was again ordered to the torture room, and there, for the last time, made to undergo another kind of punishment, which was inflicted twice without any intermission. The executioners fastened a thick iron chain round his body, which, crossing at the breast, terminated at the wrists. They then placed him with his back against a thick board, at each extremity whereof was a pulley, through which there ran a rope that caught the end of the chain at his wrists. The executioner then, stretching the end of this rope by means of a roller, placed at a distance behind him, pressed or bruised his stomach in proportion, as the ends of the chains were drawn tighter. They tortured him in this manner to such a degree that his wrists, as well as his shoulders, were quite dislocated. They were, however, soon set by the surgeons, but the barbarians, not yet satisfied with this species of cruelty, made him immediately undergo the like torture a second time, which he sustained, though, if possible, attended with keener pains, with equal constancy and resolution. After this, he was again remanded to his dungeon, attended by the surgeon to dress his bruises and adjust the part dislocated, and here he continued till their auto de fe, or jail delivery, when he was discharged, crippled, and diseased for life. An account of the cruel handling and burning of Nicholas Burton, an English merchant in Spain. The 5th day of November, about the year of our Lord 1560, Mr. Nicholas Burton, citizen sometime of London, and merchant, dwelling in the parish of Little St. Bartholomew, peaceably and quietly, following his traffic in the trade of merchandise, and being in the city of Cadiz, in the party of Andalusia in Spain, there came into his lodging a Judas, or, as they term them, a familiar of the fathers of the Inquisition, who, asking for the said Nicholas Burton, feigned that he had a letter to deliver into his own hands, by which means he spake with him immediately. And having no letter to deliver to him, then the said promoter, or familiar, at the motion of the devil his master, whose messenger he was, invented another lie, and said that he would take lading for London in such ships as the said Nicholas Burton had freighted to lade, if he would let any, which was partly to know where he loaded his goods, that they might attach them, and chiefly to protract the time until the sergeant of the Inquisition might come and apprehend the body of the said Nicholas Burton, which they did incontinently. He then, well perceiving that they were not able to burden or charge him that he had written, spoke, or done anything there in that country against the ecclesiastical or temporal laws of the same realm, boldly asked them what they had to lay to his charge, that they did so arrest him, and bade them to declare the cause, and he would answer them. Notwithstanding, they answered nothing, but commanded him with threatening words to hold his peace and not speak one word to them. And so they carried him to the filthy common prison of the town of Cadiz, where he remained in irons 14 days amongst thieves. All which time he so instructed the poor prisoners in the word of God, according to the good talent which God had given him in that behalf, and also in the Spanish tongue to utter the same, that in that short space he had well reclaimed several of those superstitious and ignorant Spaniards to embrace the word of God and to reject their popish traditions, which being known unto the officers of the Inquisition, they conveyed him laden with irons from thence to a city called Seville, into a more cruel and straiter prison called Triana, where the said fathers of the Inquisition proceeded against him secretly according to their accustomable cruel tyranny, that never after he could be suffered to write or speak to any of his nation, so that to this day it is unknown who was his accuser. Afterward, the 20th of December, they brought the said Nicholas Burton, with a great number of other prisoners, for professing the true Christian religion, into the city of Seville, to a place where the said inquisitors sat in judgment, which they called Auto, with a canvas coat, whereupon in divers parts was painted the figure of a huge devil, tormenting a soul in a flame of fire, and on his head a coping tank of the same work. His tongue was forced out of his mouth with a cloven stick fastened upon it, that he should not utter his conscience and faith to the people, and so he was set with another Englishman of Southampton, and divers other condemned men for religion, as well Frenchmen as Spaniards, upon a scaffold over against the said Inquisition, where their sentences and judgments were read and pronounced against them. And immediately after the said sentences given, they were carried from thence to the place of execution, without the city, where they most cruelly burned them, for whose constant faith God be praised. This Nicholas Burton, by the way, and in the flames of fire, had so cheerful a countenance, embracing death with all patience and gladness, that the tormentors and enemies which stood by said that the devil had his soul before he came to the fire, and therefore they said his senses of feeling were past him. It happened that after the arrest of Nicholas Burton aforesaid, Immediately all the goods and merchandise which he brought with him into Spain by the way of traffic were, according to their common usage, seized and taken into the sequester, among which they also rolled up much that appertained to another English merchant, wherewith he was credited as factor. Whereof, so soon as news was brought to the merchant as well of the imprisonment of his factor as of the arrest made upon his goods, he sent his attorney into Spain with authority from him to make claim to his goods and to demand them, whose name was John Fronton, citizen of Bristol. When his attorney was landed at Seville, and had shown all his letters and writings to the Holy House, requiring them that such goods might be delivered into his possession, answer was made to him that he must sue by bill and retain an advocate, but all was doubtless to delay him, and they forsooth of courtesy assigned him one to frame his supplication for him, and other such bills of petition, as he had to exhibit into their holy court, demanding for each bill 8 reals, albeit they stood him in no more stead than if he had put up none at all. And for the space of 3 or 4 months, this fellow missed not twice a day, attending every morning and afternoon at the Inquisitor's palace, suing unto them upon his knees for his despatch, but especially to the Bishop of Tarracon, who was at that very time chief in the Inquisition at Seville, that he of his absolute authority would command restitution to be made thereof, but the booty was so good and great that it was very hard to come by it again. At length, after he had spent 4 whole months in suits and requests, and also to no purpose, he received this answer from them, that he must show better evidence and bring more sufficient certificates out of England for proof of this matter than those which he had already presented to the court. Whereupon the party forthwith posted to London, and with all speed returned to Seville again, with more ample and large letters testimonial and certificates according to their requests, and exhibited them to the court. Notwithstanding, the inquisitors still shifted him off, excusing themselves by lack of leisure, and for that they were occupied in more weighty affairs, and with such answers put him off 4 months after. At last, when the party had well nigh spent all his money, and therefore sued the more earnestly for his despatch, they referred the matter wholly to the bishop, of whom, when he repaired unto him, he made this answer, that for himself he knew what he had to do, howbeit he was but one man, and the determination appertained to the other commissioners as well as unto him. And thus, by posting and passing it from one to another, the party could obtain no end of his suit. Yet for his importunity's sake, they were resolved to dispatch him. It was on this sort. One of the inquisitors, called Gasco, a man very well experienced in these practices, willed the party to resort unto him after dinner. The fellow being glad to hear this news, and supposing that his goods should be restored unto him, and that he was called in for that purpose to talk with the other that was in prison to confer with him about their accounts, rather through a little misunderstanding, hearing the inquisitors cast out a word that it should be needful for him to talk with the prisoner, and being thereupon more than half persuaded that at length they meant good faith, did so, and repaired thither about the evening. Immediately upon his coming, the jailer was forthwith charged with him to shut him up close in such a prison where they appointed him. The party, hoping at the first that he had been called for about some other matter, and seeing himself, contrary to his expectation, cast into a dark dungeon, perceived at length that the world went with him far otherwise than he supposed it would have done. But within 2 or 3 days after, he was brought into the court, where he began to demand his goods, and because it was a device that well served their turn, without any more circumstance, they bid him say his Ave Maria. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus. Amen. The same was written word by word as he spake it, and without any more talk of claiming his goods, because it was needless. They commanded him to prison again, and entered an action against him as a heretic, forasmuch as he did not say his Ave Maria after the Romish fashion, but ended it very suspiciously, for he should have added moreover, Sancta Maria Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, by abbreviating whereof it was evident enough, said they, that he did not allow the mediation of saints. Thus they picked a quarrel to detain him in prison a longer season, and afterward brought him forth upon their stage disguised after their manner, where sentence was given that he should lose all the goods which he sued for, though they were not his own, and besides this, suffer a year's imprisonment.